Hey, welcome to Laddercam Studio. My name is Damus, aka ProX, and this is your place to be for videography. I'm from Europe, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and when I first started with video, I watched a lot of tutorials about frame rates. What I didn't know for a long time is that Europe and the States use different frame rates. And almost all the tutorials I watched were from the States, where all settings are based on NTSC. So most settings were 24, 60 or 120 frames per second, and it wasn't until later I learned that Europe uses the PAL system. That means that I have to use 25, 50 or 100 frames per second. I know from YouTube statistics that I have a lot of viewers from the States, so if you're watching this, replace the 25 with the 24, the 50 with the 60, etc. What the NTSC and PAL system is all about, you have to Google that. I want to talk about when to use what frame rate. 25 frames per second is the most natural frame rate. It mimics the human eye because of the motion blur you see when the objects move. Movies or videos without slow motion are mostly shot in 25 frames per second, and most cinema cameras perform at its best because that's what they're built for. One of the main reasons I bought the Zcam e2m4 at first was that I could shoot up to 4K 150 frames per second and Full HD even higher. Coming from the Sony a6500 that could only go up to 4K 30 frames, I was really impressed with the amount of slow motion I got. I shot a lot of break dance battles, and nothing beats a dope move in a super slow motion. But in the edit, I only use slow motion occasionally to speed ramp now and then on a 25 frames per second timeline. It was cool at first till I found out that if you don't need slow motion and you shoot at 25 frames per second, the image quality is at its best. As I learned more about cinematography, I learned that movie makers plan their slow motion. Not every shot needs a high frame rate. If it's only dialogue, why shoot in 50 frames per second or higher? So now I only use a higher frame rate if I'm sure I need slow motion for the scene, or I'm shooting a dance battle or settings with a lot of movement, so I have more room to work with in post. 50 frames per second is the most common used slow motion in movies. Compared to a 25 frames per second shot, it's just slow enough to make it match natural. Instead of going from a 25 frames per second to 100 frames per second or higher, don't forget to double the shutter speed, else you end up with a lot of bad footage. On the Zcam e2m4, it automatically doubles the shutter speed, but on a lot of cameras, you have to manually adjust it. And I remember on my Sony and Canon cameras, I sometimes forgot to double the shutter speed and had to get real creative with the footage. For my shoots, I usually don't go higher than 50, only if it's planned ahead. And lately, I really try to avoid slow motion and just try to make nice shots on nice locations and shoot everything in 25 frames per second and edit on a 25 frames per second timeline just to keep the highest quality possible. But again, it all depends on what your shoot requires. 100 frames per second or higher is considered super slow motion. It can show moving objects in a super detailed way, make dreamy, out of this world shots, and work really well for product shots. A lot of music videos are also shot in higher frame rates to match your mood for a song or to use as B-roll. Some movies use those high frame rates every now and then just to make a scene more tense, keep the viewer locked in the scene, or to tell a story and let you experience it in super slow motion. As I mentioned earlier, I don't get higher than 50 frames per second, only if it's really needed, but I shot some moving objects in 4K 100 frames per second and in Full HD 200 frames per second, just to show you what the Zcam e2m4 super slow motion looks like. The frame rate I almost never use but should be mentioned is 30 frames per second. I know it's used for TV and corporate shoots, but I just don't like the looks. It's just a bit too sharp for me, and I prefer the 25 frames per second image more. Again, if your scene requires 30 frames per second or your client wants it in 30 frames per second, don't be afraid to use it. If you slow it down to 80% on the 25 frames per second timeline, it gives a little dreamy look, which can be nice for after movies or as B-roll. But if you use audio, sync in 35 frames per second on a 25 frames per second timeline, it's not going to work. Different settings need different frame rates. Plan your shoots ahead so you know when to use what frame rate. so you can always get the best quality in your shots. High frame rates are not always needed, but everybody loves a nice slow motion shot. So keep making them, and if you have some nice slow motion shots online, drop a link in the comments and I'll check them out. I hope this video was helpful, and if you have any questions, also put them down below in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I see you next time. Peace.